Elias Thorne knelt in the freezing slush of the alleyway, his fingers trembling as they brushed against something impossible. It wasn't the discarded copper he usually sought, but a velvet-lined case that pulsed with a secret capable of rewriting his entire destiny. Between the towering shadows of Manhattan's skyline and the crushing weight of his own anonymity, a single choice now loomed, one that could offer salvation or absolute ruin. In the heart of a city that never pauses to mourn its forgotten souls, a discarded relic of an ancient empire was about to collide with the desperation of a man who had nothing left but his pride. The morning air in the city was not merely cold, it was predatory. It possessed a sharp, metallic edge that sliced through the layers of Elias Thorne's tattered wool coat, seeking the warmth of his skin with a cruel, persistent intimacy. The sky overhead was the color of a bruised plum, transitioning into a sterile, industrial gray as the sun struggled to breach the fortress of glass and steel that defined the skyline. Elias moved with a practiced, rhythmic caution. His boot soles worn thin as parchment, crunching against the crystallization of last night's sleep. Every breath he exhaled manifested as a fleeting ghost, a translucent vapor that lingered for a heartbeat before being swallowed by the oppressive humidity of the urban dawn. For Elias, the city was not a place of opportunity, but a vast, sprawling graveyard of discarded potential. He was a scavenger, a silent witness to the excesses of a society that threw away more than he had ever owned in his entire life. His eyes, once bright with the fire of ambition, were now to steady embers of observation, scanning the gutters and the overflowing bins for the glint of copper, the weight of brass, or the salvageable remains of electronics that others deemed obsolete. His hands were a map of his history, cracked, stained with the indelible grease of 1,000 alleyways, and calloused by the relentless friction of survival. As he reached the intersection of 5th and 57th, the wind funneled through the narrow corridor of skyscrapers, a howling, low-frequency hum that vibrated within his very marrow. He paused, leaning his weight against a rusted metal cart that groaned under the burden of salvaged wire and aluminum cans. This cart was his treasury, his mobile sanctuary, and the only anchor he possessed in a world that had drifted away from him years ago. He remembered, with a bittersweet pang that felt like a physical weight in his chest, a time when he walked these same streets in a bespoke suit, the scent of expensive cologne lingering in his wake. That version of Elias Thorne had disappeared into the abyss of a market crash and a series of betrayals that had left him hollowed out, a ghost haunting the periphery of his former life. The transition from the boardroom to the gutter had been a slow, agonizing erosion of his identity, until all that remained was the primal instinct to endure. He turned into an alleyway behind one of the city's most prestigious auction houses, a narrow, dark vein between two towering structures of limestone. The scent here was a complex tapestry of decay-rotting cardboard, the ozone of industrial air conditioners, and the faint, lingering aroma of expensive coffee drifting from the ventilation ducts. He moved toward a cluster of heavy, emerald-green dumpsters. To any other observer, this was a site of refuse. To Elias, it was a site of archaeology. He began to sift through the top layers of debris, his movements deliberate and quiet. He found a discarded catalog from a recent jewelry exhibition, its glossy pages stuck together by the dampness of the morning. He tossed it aside, his mind briefly flickering with images of the diamonds it depicted, stones that cost more than the sum total of every meal he would eat for the rest of his life. It was then that he saw it. Tucked deep within a crevice between a heavy wooden crate and the brick wall was a small, rectangular object. It was wrapped in a piece of oil-stained canvas, looking like nothing more than a forgotten piece of packing material. But as Elias reached out to move it, his fingers registered a weight that was disproportionate to its size. He pulled it toward him, his heartbeat beginning to accelerate, a rhythmic thumping against his ribs that felt like a distant drum. He unwrapped the canvas with agonizing slowness, his breath catching in his throat. Beneath the grime lay a box made of dark, polished rosewood, its surface intricately carved with patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light of the alley. It was cool to the touch, a deep, resonant cold that seemed to emanate from the wood itself. With a hand that he could not keep steady, Elias pressed the small, silver latch. The lid clicked open with a sound of precision engineering, revealing a lining of deep, midnight blue velvet. Nestled within that velvet was a watch, a horological masterpiece of gold and platinum. The gears were visible through a skeletonized dial, a complex dance of miniature wheels, and springs that were still moving, ticking with a sound so faint it was like the heartbeat of a sleeping bird. Elias stared at it, his vision blurring. This was not just a timepiece, it was a Patek Philippe from a lost era, a legendary grand complication that collectors whispered about in hushed tones. Its value was incalculable, a sum of money that could buy him 1,000 lives, 1,000 warm beds, and 1,000 futures. But as he looked at it, he felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread. A piece of jewelry this magnificent did not simply find its way into a trash heap by accident. He looked around the alleyway, the shadows suddenly seeming longer, more menacing. The silence of the morning felt heavy, a physical pressure against his eardrums. He felt the weight of the city's eyes upon him, though the streets were still mostly empty. His internal monologue, usually a steady stream of tactical survival thoughts, was now a cacophony of fear and wonder. Who had left this here? Was it a drop-off for a transaction gone wrong? Was it stolen? Or was it a test? He thought of his small, damp room in the basement of a tenement building, the peeling wallpaper and the smell of mildew. This watch was the key to a door he had thought locked forever. He could sell it, disappear to a coastal town in the Mediterranean, and never look at a dumpster again. The temptation was a physical heat, a fever that burned behind his eyes. Yet, as he traced the delicate engraving on the back of the case, he saw a name. Julian Vane. The name struck a chord of recognition, a memory from his previous life of a man who was known as a philanthropist, a man whose family had built the very foundations of the city's art scene. Julian Vane had died recently, a headline that had even reached the discarded newspapers Elias used for insulation. The watch was an heirloom, a piece of history that belonged to a lineage of grace and contribution. Elias felt the familiar, nagging pull of his conscience, a vestige of the man he used to be, a man who believed in the inherent order of things. He stood there, frozen in the transition between the scavenger he was and the man he might become, the watch ticking away the seconds of his indecision. Each tick a tiny hammer strike against his resolve. The wind howled again, a mournful sound that echoed through the alley. And Elias Thorne finally closed the box, the click of the latch sounding like a finality, a beginning, or perhaps a warning. Elias Thorne moved through the waking city like a shadow attempting to detach itself from the sun. The rosewood box, tucked deep into the inner pocket of his coat, felt naturally heavy, a dense singularity that seemed to pull the very fabric of his tattered garment toward the pavement. Every few steps, he would instinctively press his forearm against his chest, confirming the hard, rectangular presence of the treasure. It was a cold and yielding anchor in a world of fluid uncertainty. The morning rush had begun in earnest now. The sidewalk was a river of polished leather shoes and sharp, charcoal gray trousers, a relentless tide of commuters who viewed the world through the narrow lens of their digital screens. To them, Elias was an invisible obstacle, a smudge on the pristine glass of their daily routine. But to Elias, every one of them was a potential threat. A silent investigator whose gaze might pierce through his grime-streaked exterior to see the multi-million-dollar secret vibrating against his rib. The paranoia was a slow-acting poison, seeping into his joints and making his movements stutter. He felt the inexorable weight of the watch's history pressing into his soul, a burden of provenance that he was ill-equipped to carry. He retreated into the subterranean maw of the subway system, seeking the relative anonymity of the underground. Here was a stagnant soup of scorched ozone, damp concrete, and the metallic tang of ancient Greece. He found a corner in a flickering, half-empty train car, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing with a high-pitched, insectoid frequency that grated against his nerves. As the train lurched forward, throwing him against the vibrating plastic seat, Elias allowed his mind to drift back to the name he had seen, Julian Vane. The name was a phantom from a life he had once inhabited. Vane had been a titan of the architectural world, a man whose vision had shaped the very skyline Elias now scavenged beneath. But the headlines from 2 weeks ago had been grim. Julian Vane had passed away in his sprawling penthouse, leaving behind a legacy of brilliance and a family embroiled in a bitter, highly publicized dispute over an estate that spanned continents. There had been mentions of a missing centerpiece, a legendary timepiece that had vanished from the Vane collection on the night of his passing. The media had speculated about high-end heists or vengeful relatives, but the truth was far more mundane and surreal. The watch was currently sitting in the pocket of a man who hadn't eaten a hot meal in 3 days. The irony was a bitter pill, dissolving slowly in the back of his throat. He closed his eyes, and the sound of the train's wheels on the tracks transformed into the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of the Patek Philippe. It was a sound of absolute precision, a defiance of the chaos that governed Elias's existence. He began to wonder about the journey that watch had taken to reach that specific, grease-stained alleyway. Had a panic thief discarded it when a perimeter was breached? Had a grieving, intoxicated heir thrown it away in a fit of nihilistic rage? The mystery was a labyrinth with no discernible center. He felt a sudden, sharp prickle of awareness on the back of his neck, that primal, evolutionary instinct that warns a creature is being watched. He opened his eyes slowly, careful not to betray his alarm. Across the aisle, a man sat perfectly still. He was dressed in a long, navy blue overcoat of impeccable cut, his hands folded over a silver-topped cane. His face was a mask of aristocratic indifference, but his eyes cold, sharp, and the color of Atlantic slate were fixed directly on Elias's chest, precisely where the box was hidden. Elias felt his heart hammer a frantic rhythm against the rosewood. The stranger didn't move, didn't blink. He simply sat there, an embodiment of the city's predatory elegance. Was this a coincidence, or had the watch already begun to broadcast its presence to the world? When the train screeched to a halt at 42nd Street, Elias bolted. He pushed through the closing doors, ignoring the indignant shouts of the people he jostled. He sprinted up the concrete stairs, his lungs burning with the icy air, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He didn't look back until he was 3 blocks away, huddled in the recessed doorway of a closed theater. His hands were shaking so violently that he had to shove them into his pockets to hide the tremors. The city felt smaller now, the skyscrapers closing in like the bars of a cage. He was no longer a ghost, he was a target. The resilience he had built up over years of homelessness was eroding, replaced by a frantic, jittery energy. He needed to think. He needed a plan. The logical, survivalist part of his brain screamed at him to find a back alley fence, someone who dealt in the shadows and didn't ask questions. He knew places in the outer boroughs where he could trade the watch for $50,000 in cash, a fraction of its value but more than enough to buy a new identity. And a quiet life in a country where the winters didn't bite. But another part of him, a vestige of the Elias Thorne who had once valued integrity above profit, hesitated. If he sold it, he was no longer a scavenger, he was a participant in the decay. He was a thief by proxy. He spent the afternoon wandering through the public library, a cavernous temple of marble and hushed whispers. He used one of the public computers to search for more details on the Vane family. He found an image of Julian Vane's daughter, Clara. Her face in the photograph was a study in profound and varnished grief, not the performative sorrow of the tabloids, but the hollowed-out look of someone who had lost their North Star. The article mentioned that the watch was a gift from her grandfather, a symbol of a promise that had spanned generations. The conflict within Elias intensified, a psychological war fought in the silence of the library's reading room. On one side stood the prospect of a life reclaimed, the end of his cold, hungry exile. On the other stood a grieving woman and the restoration of a stolen legacy. He felt the weight of the silence between his breaths, the heavy, pressurized atmosphere of his own indecision. He pulled the box from his pocket just an inch, catching a glimpse of the dark, polished wood. It looked like a coffin for his conscience. Every second that passed made it harder to turn back. The shadows in the library began to lengthen as the sun dipped behind the western buildings, casting long, skeletal fingers across the wooden tables. He realized then that he couldn't stay in the shadows forever. The man on the subway, the missing watch, the grieving daughter, all these elements were converging into a single, inescapable point of impact. His heart, once steady and hardened by the streets, now felt fragile, like the delicate balance wheel of the watch itself. He stood up, his mind made up, though his body still trembled with the terror of what he was about to do. He stepped out of the library and into the gathering dusk. the city lights flickering on like 1,000 judging eyes. The Vane Tower ascended into the obsidian sky like a jagged needle of glass and vanity, its pinnacle lost in a shroud of low-hanging clouds that glowed with the amber luminescence of the city's artificial heartbeat. Elias Thorne stood at the perimeter of the grand entrance, a solitary, tattered figure illuminated by the sterile, white radiance of the architectural uplighting. His reflection in the polished obsidian of the facade was a cruel joke, a man stitched together from the remnants of a forgotten decade. His skin the color of old parchment, and his coat a map of atmospheric neglect. The weight of the rosewood box in his pocket felt like a pulsating star, a heavy, dense core of absolute reality in a world built on illusions of permanence. He watched the revolving doors spin with the silent precision of a guillotine, swallowing and exhaling the lead of Manhattan. To step inside was to cross a border more fortified than any international frontier. It was the boundary between the discarded and the preserved. His heart, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs, beat against the box, each thud a silent question. What is the price of a soul in a city that trades only in steel and gold? As he crossed the threshold, the sudden transition from the biting, soot-heavy wind of the street to the climate-controlled, scent-infused air of the lobby was a physical shock. The atmosphere here smelled of white lilies, expensive leather, and the subtle, metallic tang of filtered oxygen. The floor was a vast, unbroken expanse of Carrara marble, so perfectly polished that Elias felt as though he were walking on the surface of a frozen lake. His boots, encrusted with the dried salt and grime of 100 gutters, left a trail of gray and sightly smears across the pristine stone. He felt the gaze of the concierge before he even reached the desk, a man whose suit cost more than Elias's entire childhood home, his eyes narrowing with a clinical, detached hostility. But before the man could speak, before the inevitable call to security could be made, a figure detached itself from the shadows near the elevators. It was the man from the subway, the one in the navy blue overcoat. Up close, he was even more formidable, a man named Mr. Sterling, though Elias would only learn that later. Sterling held up a single, gloved hand, a silent command that froze the concierge in place. "Mr. Thorne, I presume," Sterling said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that carried the weight of absolute authority. There was no mockery in his tone, only a chillingly efficient curiosity. "We have been monitoring the movements of that particular piece of history since it left the alleyway. You are either a very brave man or a very desperate one to bring it here." Elias didn't flinch. The fear that had paralyzed him on the train had evolved into a cold, crystalline resolve. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the rosewood box, holding it out in his calloused, trembling palm. The contrast between his grime-streaked hand and the polished wood was a visual symphony of the city's inequality. "It doesn't belong to me," Elias whispered, his voice raspy from disuse and the cold. "And it doesn't belong in the trash." Sterling studied him for a long, agonizing minute, the silence between them thick with the unsaid. Then, with a curt nod, he gestured toward the elevator. The ascent to the penthouse was a silent, pressurized journey, the numbers on the digital display climbing with an inexorable rhythm that felt like a countdown to his own disappearance. When the doors slid open, Elias was greeted not by a team of police, but by a room filled with the soft, mournful glow of 100 candles. Clara Vane stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her silhouette framed by the sprawling, glittering grid of Manhattan. She turned slowly, her face pale and etched with the lines of a grief that transcended wealth. When she saw the box in Elias's hand, she didn't rush forward. She simply let out a long, shuddering breath that seemed to deflate the entire room. "My father always said that the most valuable things are often found by those who aren't looking for them," she said, her voice a fragile thread of sound. Elias walked toward her, his boots silent now on the thick, silk rugs. He placed the box on a low table of ebony and steel. He watched as she opened it, the golden gears of the Patek Philippe catching the candlelight and scattering it across the room like tiny, mechanical stars. The watch was home. The circle was closed. For a moment, Elias expected the weight of his poverty to crush him. He expected to be ushered out the back door with a meager reward, a thank you that tasted like charity. But as Clara looked from the watch to the man who had returned it, something shifted in the atmosphere. She didn't see a scavenger, she saw a reflection of the resilience her father had championed. "You could have disappeared," she said, her eyes searching his. "Why didn't you?" Elias looked out at the city, at the thousands of lights representing thousands of lives, each one a flicker in the vast dark. "Because I've spent years being invisible," he replied softly. "I wanted to remember what it felt like to be seen." The reward was not a mountain of cash, though the check she eventually wrote would ensure he never slept in the cold again. The true reward was the business card she tucked into his hand, a position within the Vane Foundation's restoration project, a chance to use the hands that had scavenged for copper to rebuild the history of the city. Elias Thorne walked out of the Vane Tower an hour later. The wind was still cold, the city was still predatory, and the shadows were still long. But as he stepped onto the sidewalk, he didn't head for the alleyway. He walked toward a small diner on the corner, the neon sign flickering with a warm, inviting hum. He felt the weight of the business card in his pocket, a new anchor for a new life. The scavenger was gone, and in his place stood a man who had realized that fortune isn't found in what you keep, but in what you have the courage to return. He took a deep breath. They are no longer smelling of decay, but of the endless, bittersweet possibility of a second chance. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the skyscrapers in shades of rose and gold, and for the first time in a decade, Elias Thorne didn't look at the ground. He looked up. True integrity is not measured by what we do when the world is watching, but by the choices we make in the crushing silence of our own desperation. Our value is not defined by the weight of our pockets, but by the resilience of our character and the courage to remain honorable when life offers every reason to be otherwise. If you found a fortune in the shadows of your darkest hour, would you keep the secret to save yourself, or return it to save your soul? If this story of resilience and redemption moved you, hit the like button and subscribe to Gilded Scraps. Your support helps us tell the stories that the world often overlooks. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late for a new beginning.